Hi everybody, this is Byron Jacobs for dmbpoker.com, and today I'm looking at a hand from a 100NL game. This hand was interesting to me because I was completely confused by it and had no idea if I played correctly or incorrectly, and at all times I found it very difficult to put my opponent on any kind of range. So I thought I'd talk it through and try to explain my thoughts as much as they were, and then see what John had to say about it. So the situation is that I'm in the small blind with the King 2 of clubs. There are 4 folds round to me, and I open raise pot size with the King 2 suited combination, and the villain calls, which he will obviously do with an extremely wide range. We get a flop of ace 10 9 with 2 clubs, so I've got the nut flush draw but only king high at the moment. I decide to lead out for half pot, which I think is a fairly okay play, because obviously with my strong draw I want to put pressure on any kind of 10x or 9x hand that he might have, and I might get a situation where I can barrel all 3 streets and force him off a hand like that with my weaker holding. Now at this point the villain does something which rather surprised me. He decided to raise to $7.50, which is a fairly modest raise. It's about a half pot size raise. In fact, it's not even a half pot size raise. And I was a bit puzzled by this, because obviously this flop of ace 10 9 should favour my range much more than his. I would think as the pre-flop raiser, whereas he's just called, I have a lot more ace-x in my range than he does, and this flop should just in general connect with me better than it does with him. So I'm really not quite sure what kind of range to assign to him here. He could, I suppose, have strong hands such as ace 9 or maybe ace 10, but he might choose to 3-bet with those pre-flop, and obviously strong ace-x combinations, ace king, ace queen, you'd expect him to 3-bet those. There are obviously some drawing hands. He could have 2 clubs. He could also have maybe 8-7 or jack 8 or even jack queen for a sort of drawing combination, and I suppose 10 9 is also possible. Anyway, obviously it's not a situation where I'm going to fold. I could re-raise here, but I decided just to call. The turn now brings the king of diamonds, which at least gives me a pair, which may or may not be useful in the hand. I fairly obviously checked here, and now the villain checked behind. Again, I wasn't really sure what to make of this play in terms of his range. The 2 thoughts I had were that having raised on the flop and then checked the turn generally indicates a kind of drawing hand, so I thought maybe he does have a couple of clubs or one of the kind of open-ended straight draws, or maybe even a combination of the 2 as discussed earlier. But I also had a thought in the back of my mind that maybe he's got a strong made hand, but he's just scared that I've got queen jack. But that seems very timid. I mean, if he's got a hand like ace 9 and he's deciding to check behind here on a moderately wet board where he could get outdrawn simply because he's afraid that I might have queen jack, and if he bets he might get raised, I think that's a fairly overly timid way to handle that holding. So at this point I'm kind of thinking, he's probably got a drawing hand and I'm doing okay. So anyway, on the river we get the 5 of spades, which is a complete brick. I check, and now I'm sort of expecting him to check behind, and I'm thinking, I'm probably good with my pair of kings. But now he whops out a slightly bigger than pot-sized bet, and now I'm really not sure what to do. I was very, very tempted to call here with the pair of kings, because I think he must have quite a lot of busted draws in his range. I mean, jack 8 is busted, any 2 clubs are busted, but the problem is that I slightly block clubs, although he could have like queen 8 of clubs, maybe queen 7 of clubs. Queen jack of clubs is possible for queen jack is actually a straight, isn't it? Of course that's not possible. He's not going to play that like that. But he could have like jack 8 or 8-7. It's like he doesn't have that many busted drawing hands, but it's also hard for him to have a strong made hand that justifies this bet. So I was just completely confused and just decided to fold. So I've now keyed this hand into Poker Snowy to get an opinion, to see what Snowy thinks of the play. Snowy is fine with my initial raise from the small blind with the King 2 suited, and the villain calls, and then when we get the flop Snowy is also fine with me betting, but it's one of these situations where Snowy's looking for a mixed strategy, very balanced between betting and checking here, which kind of makes sense with my hand, I think. And when player 3 raises, Snowy actually doesn't particularly like my call and wants me to re-raise, and to be honest, I'm not quite sure what to make of that at all. Yeah, that's a kind of mystery to me. I don't really know what to make of that. Anyway, when the king comes on the turn and I check, Snowy's happy with me doing that. Obviously, we don't know what player 3 has. And then we get the river play where it blanks off. I decide to check, which Snowy is happy with, thinking checking there is fine, although wouldn't mind bet either. Player 3 then pots it. And now I decide to fold, and Snowy kind of amusingly thinks that like every single play here is kind of neutral EV for some reason. I don't know what to make of this at all. Snowy thinks I can fold call, or actually Snowy really likes shoving all in, which is slightly mysterious to me, because I think this looks to me very much like a bluff catching situation, and I do have a kind of bluff catching hand, although it's quite a weak bluff catching hand. So as I articulated right at the start of this piece, I'm just basically quite confused about this whole hand, and I'm hoping that Jonathan may be able to enlighten me. Okay, thanks very much. This has been Byron Jacobs for dmbpoker.com.
Hello, this is Jonathan Little. Right off the bat, I much prefer limping in this spot, and as we see, Snowy says that you can either call or raise, but it suggests call the vast majority of the time. And from playing around with these programs, I've seen that it definitely prefers limping with a wide range of reasonable hands from the small blind. And I think the logic is that if you raise a hand like King 2 suited and get re-raised, you're really not loving it. Whereas if you limp and get raised, you can easily call and go from there, because presumably your limping range should be much weaker than your initial raising range, or at least less nut heavy, right? So I would certainly limp in this spot, and I'd be limping with a lot of stuff. And against very, very good players, I've started just limping nearly 100% of hands, maybe 90% of hands, give or take, and just not even having a raising range. That could probably be tinkered with a bit to raise like the absolute best hands and then some garbage. But I'm a pretty big fan of limping in this spot, because if you can start limping with a range to where your opponent doesn't want to raise because they fear you getting limp re-raised by your nut hands and also by some low junky hands like 5-4 offsuit and stuff, that's going to put them in a spot where they're going to start checking a ton. And if you can limp with a very wide range, getting 3-1 pot odds, that's going to be pretty nice for you. So I like limping. On the flop, so Poker Snowy says it doesn't really matter. And in this spot, I would have leaned towards checking. And the reason I would have leaned towards checking is because you can really easily check call. Whereas if you bet and get called, now you are likely either behind or at least not loving the spot. And in this scenario, it's not like you think king high is the nuts or anything, but king high is a reasonable hand to check call the flop and the turn straight away. Like say you're sitting here with king queen, I think it'd be perfectly fine to check call flop and turn. And this has the added benefit of having the flush draw. So I probably would have checked here, but obviously betting's fine. Betting with your draws is usually always a good thing. In general, though, as your draw gets stronger or has more made, as your draw gets more showdown value, you should be more inclined to check it if you want to check with some portion of your range. So here, I don't think it really matters what you do, and that's exactly what Poker Snowy says. So you bet, and now your opponent raises, and Poker Snowy suggests re-raise. So I also would have called in this spot, citing the great pot odds. And clearly it's suggesting re-raise because it's wanting you to re-raise with your best hands and your draws, and it assumes you have a range advantage, as you mentioned, because you raised pre-flop and your opponent just called. That means that he should not have very many hands like ace-king, aces, tens, nines, maybe not even ace-10, maybe not ace-9. Clearly your opponent could have 10-9, which I think is very, very reasonable. So that's the main hand you should be concerned about in this spot. I guess ace-10 and ace-9 also makes sense. But you mentioned that you're having a hard time nailing down this range. And I do think you should have a hard time nailing down this range because we don't know what this player is doing. But in general, when you see a small raise like this, I think it is either a marginal ace that's trying to protect / find out where it stands, or a hand like a random 10 or 9 that's also trying to protect and get a free showdown. It's not a play you see a ton in No Limit Hold'em, but it is something you see from weaker players quite often. And, really, it may not even be that bad of a play if you think about it, because if he can raise with a 10 here and get you to fold out Queen 4 and not bluff him off of his hand on later streets, it's not really that bad of a play, right? So I would expect to see a lot of marginal stuff here and also some nut hands. That's what I would typically think this range looks like. I don't think very many people are raising tiny with their draws, because typically when you raise your draws, you want to get some showdown value. And typically when you raise your nut hands, typically when you raise your draws, you want to have some fold equity. There we go. And whenever you raise your nut hands, you want to raise big for protection and to get value from the worst stuff. So when you see small raises, I'm not going to say this is always the case or anything, but this is my default read. I typically think this is going to be some sort of a marginal made hand, like top pair bad kicker all the way down to bottom pair. And knowing that, if that's the range you're going to give the guy, then clearly re-raising is great, right? Because your opponent's going to fold a ton of that, or be willing to get it in and whatever, it doesn't matter, because we have the flush draw and king high, which could be something. Also, if your opponent has a draw here, let's say he does have queen jack of clubs or jack 7 of clubs, we're just getting it all in great immediately. And if we do re-raise, I don't really see how we can find a fold here. One thing I would definitely suggest you do in future videos is go through and click the other pot size options, because quite often it will have different suggestions based on different sizes. And I imagine this 50% pot bet is, I'm not going to necessarily say worse, but certainly a very different option than a 2 times pot bet. Oh, also, going back to preflop before I forget, I would have raised bigger. If you're going to raise, I would have made it $3.50 or $4 given the pot size. And again, if we go back to that, I bet if you clicked on 2 times pot, it would like raising a little bit more. Maybe not. More meaning, a larger percentage, but who knows? So anyway, you decide to call, which I think is certainly acceptable. Check. River. Interesting, it says bet sometimes. Again, notice that it's giving a bet option here if you bet small. If you were to click like a pot size bet here, or half pot bet, I bet it would say, or I would imagine it says that you should bet less often. Because as you start betting bigger, you're going to make the worst hands fold. But when you bet tiny, notice it's saying 25% pot. So when you bet $5, stuff like queen 10 is just going to find a hero call. So that's why it's suggesting bet here. But if you bet bigger, it's probably not going to suggest bet so often. Unless, 2x pot, it may actually say bet sometimes. Because then you're going to make some better hands fold. Although, probably not. So anyway, you check, which I think is obviously, or most likely, the right play. And now your opponent bets big. And then it suggests shove, fold, or call. Who knows what to do. And in these spots, that's often how it feels. Is who knows what to do. And in poker, there are a lot of scenarios, especially on the river, where you have some marginal hand where it doesn't really matter what you do. The interesting thing here is I would have expected to say call or fold, yet it says jam with this combination. And why would it say jam with this combination? Well, you block ace-king, which is relevant. Your opponent's pre-flop range probably doesn't include hands like ace-king. If your opponent had a hand like 10-9, he may fold it to a shove. If he had a hand like ace-7, he may fold it to a shove. I don't really know. Like you said, this is a perplexing spot, and I do not know really why it is saying to shove with this one. I would have assumed it would say to shove with worse hands, like 8-7 offsuit or jack-8 offsuit, because then your opponent could have busted flush draws and could also have busted straight draws. And typically, when you're shoving, you either want to have hands that have no showdown value whatsoever, cannot call, obviously, which is not really what we have here. And you also want to have hands that don't block the draws that your opponent could be bluffing with. And so here with the king of clubs, it's kind of interesting. It's not really a blocker to the busted flush draws, right? And also we beat all the flush draws, which is another reason I would think it says to call. Notice here, even though we don't have a great hand, we do beat all of the draws besides queen jack that came in. So it's kind of tough for our opponent to have it's kind of tough for our opponent to be betting with a hand like a marginal made hand that beats us at this point, unless he's betting a hand like ace-7 The big bet on the river is the reason I don't think he's going to have too many ace sevens, though, because a lot of people just bet small with that hand. Kind of like how Poker Snowy just suggested you bet small on the river if you're going to bet. You think your opponent's going to bet somewhat small with ace seven in that spot, unless he's doing what's referred to as merging, where he just bets everything big. And by doing that, by betting with more value hands big, you can bet with more bluffs. But I don't think your opponent has very many bluffs in his range, given you think you just bet those on the turn. I mean, why wouldn't he bet those on the turn if he had bad draws like Jack 8 and 8-7? Those are pretty great hands to bet on the turn. So anyway, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to tell you to do. And quite often, playing with game theory optimal programs in this spot, or spots like this, also won't really tell you what to do because these are very player-dependent scenarios. And I imagine Poker Snowy's pre-flop assessment about your opponent is really factoring into what you should do on the river. He's probably thinking your opponent doesn't have very many ace 10s or ace kings or aces or 10s or 9s or kings. So if your opponent has none of those, well, what does he have? I mean, he may not even have queen jack. I think calling queen jack pre-flop is probably standard in your opponent's spot, but if the only hand you're worried about is queen jack, and queen jack almost certainly bets the turn, well, he doesn't have queen jack either, right? So now the best hand the guy can have is ace 5. So if the best hand he can have is ace 5, then that really, really caps him, right? So how would you play hands like queen jack? So let's say we bet the flop, got raised, and we called. Turns a king, it would go check, check. On the river, would we check raise? I mean, maybe that makes some sense to try to get value from busted draws and stuff like that. But you can't really expect hands like jack 10 or 9-4 to bet again. I feel like I'm rambling at this point, but this is a weird spot. I don't know why it's saying to raise with this combination. I mean, I understand that the only reason I would assume is that your opponent is, or that Poker Snowy is assuming that your opponent's range is relatively weak to start, and when he checks behind the turn, it also assumes the range is weak because a lot of the nut hands like ace 9 or 10-9 would want to keep betting to protect their equity. So given they did not bet to protect their equity, then that means that your opponent probably doesn't have those. So if your opponent doesn't have those, it means he's pretty capped at a range like ace 5, and if he's capped at ace 5, well, then you can justify shoving a lot because your opponent's going to have a tough time calling. That said, the Poker Snowy program is just going to come up with some GTO solution, so it doesn't really matter what you do. So if you're going to have a shoving range, I don't know why it would suggest this one. So interesting spot. Cool hand. Thanks for sharing it. Sorry I didn't know the right answer. Sorry, I don't even know how to formulate the right answer on this one. This is a fun one. And this is why playing with programs like Poker Snowy is great, because whether or not Poker Snowy is even giving the 100% optimal advice in this spot, because it's assuming different ranges than we are most likely, it's good to think about these spots and try to figure out new lines and interesting lines that maybe are better than what you're doing naturally. This has been Jonathan Little for dnbpoker.com. Thanks for watching.